We will be going through today my 2024 Inspector Calls predictions and essay plans for my predictions, so you know what to write if they do come up. Also, if they don't come up, you can still use the essay plans and just adapt them to whatever the question is. So it's important firstly for us to go through what's come up and then I can tell you my predictions. In 2017, the two questions were, how far does Precy present Mrs. Birling as an unlikable character? And how does Precy use the inspector to suggest ways that society could be improved? In 2018, it was how far does Precy present Eric as a character who changes his attitudes towards himself and others? And the second question was how does Precy explore the importance of social class in an Inspector Calls? 2019, it was how does Precy present selfishness and its effects in an Inspector Calls? And how does Precy present Sheila as a character who learns important lessons about herself and society? 2020, it was how far does Precy present Mr. Birling as a man who cares only for himself and his family? And the second question was how far does Precy present male characters as irresponsible in the play? 2021, it was how does Precy use Gerald to explore ideas about responsibility? And how does Precy present society as unfair in an Inspector Calls? 2022, how far does Precy present Eric as a character who learns important lessons about society in an Inspector Calls? And Precy shows how inequality in society leads to tragedy. How far do you agree with this view in Inspector Calls? And then finally, 2023, how does Precy present what life is like for women in Inspector Calls? And how does Precy present the different ways older and younger generations respond to the inspector? So that's what's come up so far. So I'm going to break down my predictions into a character prediction and a theme prediction, because that is what they tend to assess, one character, one theme. So my character prediction is Mrs. Birling. Now, Mrs. Birling hasn't been assessed since 2017. We've seen a lot about like male characters, about the inspector. The inspector I would have said, but he came up in 2017 and hadn't really been assessed much since. But then the 2023 question was linking it to the inspector, older versus younger generation. So I'm gonna say mostly Mrs. Birling, potentially could be the inspector, but Mrs. Birling is gonna be my prediction. So let's go through an essay plan for if Mrs. Birling does come up, what are 3 points that you can say and some quotes that you can use for it too. All of the analysis for the quotes, all of the points, the high level analysis, vocabulary, all of that kind of stuff can be found on the Light Up Hub, which we'll put a link in the description below, and I'll even link some free lessons for you guys. Okay, firstly, so when we're doing a plan, the easiest way that I think it is to plan stuff is to link it to key themes, particularly if it's for a character. So for Mrs. Birling, I'm gonna link 3 different key themes. I'm gonna link the key themes of social class, older versus younger generation, and capitalism versus socialism. So my first point is gonna be on social class. Mrs. Birling is a marionette, so puppet, for the upper echelons in society. She actively tries to oppress and exploit the lower social classes so she can maintain a position of social superiority. So what I'm saying here, if we know about Mrs. Birling, remember, Mrs. Birling is of a higher social class than the rest of her family. Remember society like a pyramid. Right at the top of the pyramid, we have royalty. So that would be like the king, the queen. Then underneath that, we have aristocracy, which would be like lords and ladies. And that is where Gerald would be. Then we have the upper class, and that is where Mrs. Birling is. As we know, she's her husband's social superior. Then underneath that, we've got the middle class, and the Birlings would be in that class, but they're the upper middle class. So they're at the top of the middle class. They're not quite the upper class, but they're the upper middle class. Then we have the lower class, which we see Eva/Daisy would fit into. So the whole first point about social class is she is a marionette, a puppet for her social class. As a member of the upper class, she tries to preserve her social superiority, so her socially superior status, because it benefits her. It benefits her for the lower classes to stay inferior. It benefits her for them to exploit them because they can get more money out of them. So that is, it's a whole, when you link it to social class with Mr. or Mrs. Birling, she's trying to uphold these exploitative means like treating someone harmfully and using their weaknesses against them. And then here are 2 quotes that you could use to support that point. Girls of that class in Act 2, and she was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. Act 2. So both of those show her prejudices, so her harmful views towards the lower social classes, which of course is reinforced by her believing that she is socially superior and therefore should be able to exploit them. My second point, I'm going to link to older versus younger generation. It makes it super easy if we're linking it to key themes, because then it just gives us a really clear focus for each paragraph. Precy constructs Mrs. Birling as a microcosm. Remember, microcosm is something small representing something larger, of the obdurate, stubborn, older generation. She remains entrenched, stuck in her stagnant, not moving, beliefs of responsibility and morality. Such a nice idea to link to older versus young generation, that they are obdurate. Love, love, love this word. You'll see on the Light Up Hub, if you're a Light Up Hub member, I love to use obdurate for the older generation of Mr. and Mrs. Birling. It summarizes them perfectly. And also another good phrase is entrenched in her beliefs. So she's stuck in those beliefs, the generational beliefs of her social class, as well as, of course, her older generation, believing that they're the most wise, they're the most shrewd, so they're the most on it, and that the younger generations are naive and easily impressionable. So anything about the older generation is linking to how they, of course, refuse to take this responsibility because they're so entrenched in their generational beliefs, they're so ignorant to their actions, and they're unwilling to change, which of course is a nice juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is just like a contrast with the younger generation, which is personified through Sheila and Eric. So the two quotes I would use are, "You're quite wrong to suppose I shall regret what I did." Act 2. "You seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector, but I'm afraid you'll have to get used to that, just as I had." So the first quote really shows her obdurate nature. She's entrenched in these beliefs. She's refusing to take personal responsibility. She doesn't believe that she has to be responsible for her actions, that she can absolve, so free herself from responsibility. And the second one really clearly shows the distinction between the older versus younger generation, how she's mocking the great impression the inspector has made on Sheila and Eric, because she is mocking of change. She believes that change is synonymous with being impressionable and naive, and of course that encapsulates the older generation's beliefs. We've got so much nice analysis on Mrs. Birling. So any Light Up Hub members, if you go on the theme videos, so if you go on Inspector Calls, go on the theme videos, go on Mrs. Birling, we'll have all of the key themes done for you for her, linked already with the analysis. And we've got some really, really nice analysis as well, linking her to social class and how that links to her contribution of her ideas in the older generation. And the third point I would make would be about capitalism. So we're gonna link Mrs. Birling to capitalism. Remember, capitalism is the belief that what one earns shouldn't be shared. Mrs. Birling is constructed by Precy to vilify the unscrupulousness, immorality, of capitalists. She personifies capitalist ideologies through her favouring of profits over people, despite her outward appearance of philanthropy. Now, this is such a nice idea, linking it to capitalism, but specifically to the character of Mrs. Birling. Mrs. Birling runs a charity. We know that because, of course, she denies Eva Smith the help from her charity. So when we say philanthropy, her being charitable or philanthropic, it directly criticises how capitalists put on this facade, so mask, of being charitable, helpful, yet their only fixation and their only priority is valuing profits, so like materialism, money, over people. They do not lead with compassion. They do not lead with benevolence, like love and care. They lead with profit and exploitation. And that is illustrated through Mrs. Birling. So of course she personifies, so if capitalism was a person, it'd be Mrs. Birling. She personifies capitalism. We see the real contradiction with her running a charity and yet her neglecting the lower classes, being exploitative, and holding these capitalist ideologies. So some key quotes that we could link this to. "I consider I did my duty," Act 3. "And if I was, what business is it of yours?" Act 3. So linking it to the idea of duty, she believes it's her duty to perpetuate exploitation and suffering at the expense of increasing the prices, the cost, to benefit her and her capitalist family. And then also the second quote is her questioning the inspector, getting quite defensive when he interrogates her. She will have such hatred for the inspector, not only because he's of course trying to make her be responsible and develop this collective social conscience. Conscience is knowing right from wrong, so collective social conscience is knowing right from wrong in society. She will also hate him because he personifies socialism. And of course, as a capitalist, socialist ideologies directly threaten capitalist ideologies. So that is another reason why she gets so defensive, because she hates socialists, shockingly. Okay, my second prediction for themes. That themes are hard because there could be so many different things that they ask. They've asked quite a lot of the key themes before. They basically asked all of the characters. So these are ones they haven't really examined that I think could come up. First one is guilt. Now they've linked a lot about like responsibility and like social class. I think maybe potentially a question specifically on guilt could come up. maybe linking it to like how different characters feel guilt and linking that in some way. Second one is the importance of social responsibility. Now in 2020, they did it about male characters being irresponsible. In 2021, it was about Gerald being responsible, but they haven't asked anything about social responsibility and linking it to all of the characters. And then my third prediction, and this has not come up at all, is capitalism versus socialism. There's been no specific questions about being capitalist or socialist, so I think that could be a good one that they might examine. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you an essay plan for capitalism versus socialism, because that's the one I think is potentially most likely to come up. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is my best prediction I could make. Of course, you can adapt this to other essays as well, so it is still useful. So when we're doing a theme question, I always want you to link it to 3 very distinctly different characters. So for example, the first paragraph should be on like either Mr. or Mrs. Birling. I'd choose one, Mr. or Mrs. Birling, because they're quite similar in their analysis. You don't really want to do paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 on Mr. and Mrs. Birling, because your analysis will probably overlap, and we want to have as many varied points as possible to show the examiner how good we are with our analysis. Second paragraph, I choose either Sheila or Eric. Again, they're quite similar characters in terms of like socialism and being progressive. We don't want to overlap those ideas. And then the third paragraph, I tend to do the inspector. Now I'd say for any theme question, always do the inspector, because the inspector is different from all the other characters. He is Precy's mouthpiece. So like Precy can't be in the play himself, so uses the inspector to vocalize his beliefs. So I would always do a paragraph on the inspector for a theme question, unless it's of course something about like female characters and then you can't. But yeah, inspectors a must. So the first paragraph, I'm gonna do Mrs. Birling, and I'm just gonna use one of the points I used from the last essay plan just to show you how transferable it is. Mrs. Birling is constructed by Precy to vilify the unscrupulousness, so immorality, of capitalists. She personifies capitalist ideologies through her favouring of profits over people, despite her outward appearance of philanthropy. So we've already touched base on that. Remember, philanthropic, being charitable, and how her outward appearance of being philanthropic does not match her capitalist ideologies. And as a reminder, the 2 quotes that you could use for this: I consider I did my duty, Act 3, and if I was, what business is it of yours, Act 3. And the second paragraph I would do would be on Sheila. Now Sheila, I'd be linking it to socialism and how she becomes liberated and progressive because of her introduction to socialism. Sheila is constructed to be liberated, so free, by socialism. Her emancipation from the oppressive shackles of capitalism are as a result of her introduction to the inspector, the personification of socialism. Now this is a really nice idea, it's a nice phrasing as well, the oppressive shackles of capitalism. Imagine like she's been restricted, she's been chained up by these capitalist ideologies, but through the introduction to the inspector, she becomes liberated, she becomes completely free. And it's a nice comparison as well you can make. If you have a look at like Sheila in Act 1 and how she was restricted and oppressed, then you can compare it with her in Act 3 as well. If you want it, on the lighter pub, if you go on either Sheila Act 1, you can watch the Sheila Act 1 video and then watch the Sheila Act 3 video, and then you can compare them. Or if you want, you can have a look at the Sheila key theme video, and that will cover the key themes and compare her throughout anyway. So the key quotes we can link to this are: I'll never, never do it again to anybody, Act 1, fire and blood and anguish, Act 3. So of course, in Act 1, we see her remorse. We see her feeling guilty for her actions and her immoral actions at that. So we can see that because of course the introduction of socialism, she is now developing a collective social conscience. Remember, conscience, knowing right from wrong, collective social conscience, knowing right from wrong in society. So that really nice phrasing that she has been emancipated, so freed from capitalism through the inspector, who of course personifies socialism. And then the second quote of fire and blood and anguish, this is because Sheila is the inspector's proxy. Now proxy means that she just takes on his role as he leaves. So she is the inspector's proxy because she is now relaying his exact teachings back to her family. Again, linking nicely to that idea, she's been freed from the oppressive shackles of capitalism, and she's now actually becoming a moral compass to her family. Think moral compass. A compass gives you directions. Moral compass, she's giving her family moral directions as to what they should do. And then the third paragraph is on the inspector. Precy creates the inspector to be his mouthpiece, to speak his views, advocating for a collective social conscience in society and highlighting that socialism is the necessary solution for creating social equality and social reform. So always, if you are talking about the inspector, make sure you say he's Precy's mouthpiece. So remember, like I said earlier, Precy cannot be in the play himself, so uses the inspector to vocalise his beliefs. So when we're talking about the inspector, if we're linking it to the broader socialist message of Priestley, Priestley's trying to illustrate that socialism equals a progressive society, whereas capitalism equals a regressive society. Now, progress means to go forward, regress means to go back. So therefore, through the inspector, he is making it synonymous, so closely linked, in his audience's mind, that socialism is synonymous, so it's closely linked, with social equality and social reform, as shown through the inspector. Because think, the inspector comes in, he encourages Sheila and Eric to be more responsible, which are very desirable traits for people to have. And if you magnify that on society as a whole, it's very desirable for everyone to be responsible. So therefore, it signifies that socialism is the adequate and the best solution to achieving what society would want. And nobody's going to sit there in society and be like, we don't want equality, we don't want fairness, because they are social ideals. That is what we all strive for in society. So therefore, Priestley is showing through the inspector that socialism is that solution. And the quotes that we could use for that are, public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges, Act 2. And we don't live alone, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other, Act 3. So both quotes just encapsulate the idea of that collective social conscience, responsibility, being scrupulous, so being moral, which of course directly contrasts the attitudes of capitalists, personified through like Mr. and Mrs. Birling, who are irresponsible, they are unscrupulous, so immoral. They reject responsibility. They do not develop a collective social conscience. So the inspector is used as a real contrast with Mr. and Mrs. Birling, therefore, again, painting socialism in this more positive light. So they are my predictions and essay plans. Like I said, you can adapt these for any essays. If you did like this, guys, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've been putting out more videos. Send this to your friends to help them out as well. Stay tuned for some more videos. We're posting about 2 to 3 times per week at the moment to make sure that you guys ace it for your exams. And remember, if you do want all of this in a lot more detail, check out the Light Up Hub. The link is going to be in the description below, and there'll be a link to free lessons. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.